Please open your Bibles to Philippians chapter 2. This will be our text for this morning. Philippians chapter 2, and we're going to read just verses 12 and 13. Philippians 2, 12 and 13. Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Now, we're actually continuing this morning our series of sermons where we've been working through Philippians. So we've covered, beginning in chapter 1 up to this point into chapter 2, and we've been going through this, trying to answer the question, what is joy? What is biblical joy, and how do we have it? And up to this point, I hope you've been able to see, for those of you who have been with us through all these sermons, especially in some other sermons we've done in discussing joy even outside Philippians, that joy is much more than just a passive emotional response, where something happens to me and I respond. That's more elation. But biblical joy is a little bit different. In fact, biblical joy is a fruit of the Spirit, and I believe that it behaves very similarly to other aspects of the fruit of the Spirit, such as love. Love is not just an emotional response. It's really cultivated over time through practice, through engaging other people. You learn to love someone in a marriage over years. And you begin to learn that your initial idea of love is much different than maybe what you've grown into. And love is something it's an action you engage. And other aspects of the fruit of the Spirit are going to be self-control. It's an action that we engage, that we cultivate over time. Or patience. Patience is an action we engage and we cultivate over time and we grow in it. And I think joy is very similar to that. That joy is something we engage, and it comes out of us acting and doing things. And this joy that we have, this Christian joy, is not just emotional elation, because that's really hard to be emotionally elated. For example, when you're Paul and you're in prison. But it's not hard to be joyful when you understand what joy is. And so throughout these series of lessons, I've been trying to help us to disassociate what the world says joy is, because I think that's wrong. In fact, I think that can be very harmful when people start wondering, why does Paul say rejoice always and I don't feel joyful all the time? Well, it's because it's not just an emotion. In the same way, the world teaches us that loving someone is the same as emotional affection. And when you lose your emotional affection, you no longer love someone. Well, that's harmful. Not only is it wrong, but it's harmful to understand it in that way. And I think joy is very similar. It's different than what the world teaches us. And a misunderstanding of it can be harmful. So we've been looking at, how do we cultivate joy? What are the things that we do? What do we go through? And we looked at things like working together, partnership. Paul speaks tremendously of partnership, especially partners in the gospel. And if we're not partners with other Christians in working in something together, I think it's really hard to have joy, to just kind of be on our own in an island unto ourselves. And we looked a little bit at Christ, this emptying himself in chapter 2. Now we're going to get into what I'm going to call thoughtful obedience. And I hope that as we look throughout this passage in this lesson, I'll better understand what thoughtful obedience is. But really, I'm going to make the case this morning that obedience and thoughtful obedience is necessary as Christians to cultivate joy. And in fact, things like disobedience don't often cultivate very much joy in our lives. In fact, when we're disobedient, we often feel guilty about it. And we talked even in our class this morning in Hebrews about how guilt and this not having a purified conscience can really prevent us from becoming a whole person. So obedience, therefore, is necessary in cultivating joy. But I want us to understand obedience correctly, because sometimes we have a wrong idea of obedience, that it's just something I have to do, and it kind of gets in the way of the things I really want to do. And I really want us to approach obedience from a different angle. And so you may be able to see on the board this morning, we're actually going to be spending some time in the book of Ruth this morning. We're actually going to go to the story of Ruth. We just don't have the time to read 4 chapters out loud. But I will go through the story of Ruth, and I want to bring the story of Ruth into verses 12 and 13 to help us understand this passage. Because whether you realize it or not, this passage is really a difficult passage. This is one that many people struggle with. And I think if we take a moment and realize what it's saying, we can understand what their struggle is. And maybe we'll even ask the question, well, why haven't I struggled with this passage before? Because these 2 verses are kind of hard verses. And that's why I'm only dealing with this morning these 2 verses, because they're a little bit difficult. Because notice what Paul says. He says, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. I want to just discuss the difficulty of this passage before we move into the book of Ruth and how we're going to deal with this passage. The difficulty of this passage begins with that it appears to say 2 things at once, 2 contrary things at once. That at first it appears to say, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. That is, you do this for yourself. You make the choices. You make the decisions. You do this because you're going to be the one who is held accountable, which is very important for us to keep in mind, that no one can stand before Christ for us. We will all give an account of ourselves. So do this for yourself. Work out your own salvation. And this is not saying that you work in order to be saved. The idea here is more like work to bring your salvation to completion. That's, I think, more what the idea here is. I agree with commentators who have brought this up. The idea is more you work to bring your salvation to completion, that Jesus has saved us, but we work and make decisions on our own to bring this salvation to total completion. So on one hand, Paul says, do this for yourself. These are your choices. These are your decisions. You will answer for them. But then he says, for it is God who works in you. And if we take a moment and think about that, we should be asking the question, well, who's doing the working? Is it me or is it God? And that's partly the difficulty in this passage. Because it appears to say, do this for yourself, but then it says, God is doing it for you or through you. And we should be asking, well, who's doing it, me or God? And that's a really hard question to answer. And the question really arises out of the difficulty some people have with free will. Because that's a hard thing to really understand when we start breaking it down. Free will is, to put it very simply, this idea that we can act without being forced to act. that I can freely make decisions on my own. And yet, even though this passage says I can freely make decisions on my own, in fact, I must make decisions on my own. I must work out my salvation with fear and trembling. This passage also says that God is the one who works in you both to will and to work for his good pleasure. And so the question that many people have struggled with, not just in Christianity, but elsewhere, all throughout the history of philosophy and those kinds of things, the issue is, if I stand up to grab a glass of milk, did I do it on my own, or was I predestined to do it? Right? Was it written ahead of time? And that's a really hard question to answer, because the truth is that the Bible does at times speak to free will, and the Bible does at times speak to the fact that God has a plan. So for example, in Ephesians, we do read Paul writing in Ephesians chapter 1, verse 5, that we have been predestined to adoption. That's just one of many places where Paul actually references this idea that God has a plan and God has foreordained certain things to happen. And so this becomes a real struggle. Well, which is it? Am I making decisions, or is God making decisions and I'm just kind of a robot going through the motions? And I'm going to tell you what I think is the answer. Then we're going to look at Ruth, and then we're going to bring the context of Ruth back into this passage. And I think the answer is that this passage is in favor both of God's sovereignty and our free choices. In fact, I don't know how else to read this passage. When it says, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you. And we ask, well, who's doing it? Is it me or is it God? The answer is both. It's both. That God is so powerful, so omniscient and omnipotent, God can work out a plan even through free will. And that these are not in contradiction to each other. Now that's kind of the difficulty of this passage. I really want you to see the difficulty in it before we answer it. Because if we just answer it, then we've really glossed over much of what's going on here. So now I want to jump to this, the book of Ruth. And like I said, we're not going to read the entire book, which we don't have the time for that, don't have the attention spans for that. It's unpleasant to hear someone read 4 chapters straight. I think so. So I want us to kind of remind ourselves of the book of Ruth, or maybe this may be your first time hearing it, that the book of Ruth is the story really of course, Ruth, as well as Naomi. Naomi is just the mastermind, really, apart from God, behind the entire book, I think. Naomi is just a brilliant woman, very faithful woman, and an example for all of us of what it is to follow God even in the midst of suffering. So the book opens with a famine during the days of the judges. And it's important to keep that in mind, because the time period of the judges in Israel was a very dark time in Israel's history. Even the judges themselves, who God appointed to bring this kind of redemption and this release to Israel, even many of the judges were very wicked people and did really awful things. And so when you read, if you're reading through your Bible in order, you read Judges, and it just ends with this idea of everyone did what was right in his own eyes, and no one knew God. And then you get to Ruth and you realize things are a little different. There were still some really faithful people during that time. So it opens with this famine, And Naomi and her husband, Elimelech, they decide to go to Moab. Actually, it's really Elimelech's choice. Elimelech takes his wife Naomi to Moab, which is outside of Israel. They're not supposed to be going and living in other foreign lands as Jews, but he does that to escape this famine. And when they go there, Elimelech dies, Naomi's husband dies. And then their two sons marry Moabitesses, women of the land of Moab, Orpah and Ruth. And then they hear that their famine in Israel ends. And that's when Naomi decides to return to Bethlehem. And Naomi tells Orpah and Ruth, you shouldn't follow along with me. I have would you wait for me to have sons in order to remarry? Which is a reference to what's called the Levirate Law. And the Levirate Law, you have to know what that is in order to make sense of Ruth. Which is this idea that the nearest kin raises offspring to a deceased relative. So if I were a Jew and my brother dies, and my brother has no offspring, I am required by law to raise up offspring for my brother through his wife so that his children can receive the inheritance, and the inheritance goes through the family. So Naomi tells them, are you going to wait for me to have offspring in order to remarry to Ruth and Orpah? And Orpah decides not to return to Jerusalem, not to return to Bethlehem, which is her choice. But Ruth decides to return with Naomi and makes this declaration that, your God will be my God and your people will be my people. And so Ruth goes with Naomi back to Bethlehem, and Naomi makes this remark, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Lord has dealt bitterly with me. Because Mara means bitterness. Because Naomi has lost her husband, she's lost her two sons, and she just feels like God has broken her. So after Naomi and Ruth return, Ruth goes to take care of Naomi by gleaning the fields. And she goes into these fields, and she's allowed to do this because this is also allowed under the law. That if you owned property, you didn't glean to the edges. You left the outside perimeter for the foreigner, for the alien, for the poor, that they were allowed to go into your field. So if you owned land, you couldn't reap to the edges of your field. So Naomi goes to this land, goes to someone's land, starts gleaning of the edges in order to provide for Naomi. Ruth goes to in order to provide for Naomi. And Ruth happens upon the land of Boaz. And Boaz is very taken with Ruth. He admires her determination greatly, admires her desire to take care of her mother-in-law. And so Boaz allows Ruth to glean all day and even gives her extra. And when Ruth returns to Naomi, Naomi says, well, hey, Boaz is one of our relatives. He's one of our redeemers. And so you have this kind of chance meeting between Ruth and Boaz, and Naomi, her mind starts working. She decides she's going to send Ruth to Boaz. And so Naomi kind of formulates this plan of sending Ruth to Boaz at his threshing floor. So Boaz is laying there at night, and Ruth comes and kind of lays by his feet in the evening. And in the morning, when Boaz wakes up, he realizes what's happening, and that Ruth is there, and she's probably been sent. And Boaz greatly admires her and tells her, you did well in not going to young people. You did well in coming to someone who is mature and who can take care of you. So then Boaz tells Ruth, yes, I am a redeemer, but there is someone who can redeem you before me, a nearer kin. And so Ruth goes back to Naomi, explains to Naomi, there's this nearer redeemer, this nearer kin, but Boaz has agreed to redeem should he not. And Naomi makes the remark, he will take care of the matter today. And so at the end, in chapter 4 of the book of Ruth, the conclusion is that Boaz goes to this redeemer, and Boaz explains to him, Naomi is going to sell her property. Do you wish to buy it, to purchase it as the nearest redeemer? And he says, yes. And then Boaz says, in purchasing the property, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabitess, in order to raise up offspring. And that's when the near redeemer declines and says, I'm not going to do it. So in front of all the elders, Boaz purchases and redeems Naomi's property as well as takes care of Ruth, acquires Ruth and raises up offspring. And the book ends with a genealogy leading from Ruth and Boaz to King David. And that's the end of the book of Ruth. So now that we've got Ruth kind of in our mind, I want us to take the story of Ruth. This story, it's really a love story, a story that brings about this great king. I want us to take that and now plug that back into these passages in Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 and 13. And I want to point out first that Ruth is full of people freely making decisions, freely choosing on their own to do things. Ruth, for example, decides to stay with Naomi while Orpah leaves. That's totally Ruth's decision. Ruth decides to return with Naomi so that her God will be her God and her people will be her people. No one forced her to do it. She chose it. Ruth is full of people making decisions, such as Boaz deciding to help Ruth. Right? Boaz wasn't required to do that, but he decided to. You have the decision of the other redeemer not purchasing Naomi's property. He decides to do that. And through all of Ruth, when you take a moment and you see all the turning points, you realize the law of Moses is totally at work. So you have, as I said, this levirate law, which at first is what Naomi cites to say, why are you returning with me? Are you going to wait for me to have other children and then wait for them to grow up and then marry them? That's absurd. But Ruth decides to go anyway. Or you have Boaz, a man who is making just and right decisions in a very wicked time. In fact, in Ruth, Naomi tells Ruth, you should not go into someone else's field because you'll be assaulted. That is, she'll be probably beaten and raped. But Boaz is an upright guy, someone who fears God, someone who understands, to love your neighbor as yourself, as even the law taught. You have Naomi then allowed, according to God's law, in fact, really required by God's law, to sell her property, so that the nearest redeemer can bring up offspring so that they can inherit it, because God did not want the land of one family to suddenly go to another family. In fact, there was a time period where if that happened, it had to return to the original family. And you see when you read Ruth, God's laws at work in people's free choices to bring about good and to bring about God's plan. Because as I said, the book of Ruth ends with the genealogy leading up to King David. And of course, the Messiah comes from King David. So you have God's laws at work as people are freely making choices and making very thoughtful choices. And all of it is bringing about the goodness and the plan of God. And I think that's exactly what we see here in Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 and 13. That it is not either my free will or it is God's sovereign plan. It is God sovereignly working through my free will and through my, what I'm calling thoughtful obedience. Not just any kind of obedience. This is a kind of obedience that we calculate, we make decisions about, that we decide about what is right and wrong. We decide about good and evil. And we make calculated, thoughtful decisions about obedience to God. This isn't, for example, mindless obedience. This isn't an obedience that views obedience as simply do this, don't do this. This is a very thoughtful obedience, understanding that my actions have an impact on the larger world. I mean, do you think Ruth had any idea that her decisions would bring about the Messiah and thus the redemption for all of mankind? Those little decisions she made along the way, God worked through them to affect everyone. You see, sometimes we have a very small view of obedience. And we view it as just do this, don't do this, and I have to do it even though I don't really want to do it. Or sometimes we think about it as just this is between me and God. When really our obedience and our thoughtful obedience affects other people too. And it's not just about me. And it's not just about you. Our obedience all works together into this kind of, this enormous stew, right? This enormous soup that God is just kind of stirring all together as we all make decisions and we all make choices, and God is bringing it all together so that what comes out can be nothing but good and beautiful. And sometimes it doesn't seem like it in the moment. Naomi, like I said, she had this declaration, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. The Lord has dealt bitterly with me. And then at the end, she's happy and she's joyful again. Because now she has grandchildren and people are calling her blessed, and she agrees with them. Yes, the Lord has blessed me. I mean, consider what I just said about a soup analogy. Sometimes if you just take, for example, an individual diced potato and eat it, it doesn't taste very good. Or if you just take like a bunch of parsley, put it in your mouth, like that does not taste good. And sometimes in the moment, our suffering and our struggles, they don't taste good. But we lose sight of the fact, sometimes we lose sight of the fact that God is making a big stew. He's making a big soup. And sometimes that stuff needs to cook for a little bit in order to taste better. And sometimes the soup needs to sit and simmer with the parsley in order to take on its flavor. And sometimes my individual thoughtful obedience may not do exactly what I think it's going to do and may bring about a kind of bitterness and something that bothers me or it's difficult. But you've got to let it take time, I think. We've got to let it take time so that it sits and it simmers and it mixes with this great big soup that God is making of our decisions. And I think that is exactly what you see here in Philippians 2:12 and 13. I'd like to reread these. Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. It's not just my decisions or God predestines things. It's all of it working together. It is God working through me in my individual, thoughtful, obedient decisions to bring about things that are wondrous and good. And let's put it like this as well. If obedience to the law of Moses could bring about something as good as King David and the Messiah, how much more obedience to the law of liberty through Christ? I mean, the law of Moses, Paul talks about it as this covenant of death that is passing away. And yet obedience to that could bring about something as wonderful as King David and the Messiah. How much more our obedience through Christ can bring about wonderful things in this world. This is my way of trying to help us understand obedience, and an obedience that brings about joy. Because sometimes when we view obedience from the wrong perspective, it's not very joyful. It gets in our way of what we really want to do. And it just feels like an obligation. But when you begin to understand obedience, as we see it in Ruth, as we see it here, you begin to see obedience is a way of God working through things to bring about better things. And we need to trust God in that. And like I said, if God can bring about something as wonderful as the Messiah through obedience to the law of Moses, how much more can God bring about wonderful things through our obedience to Christ? And in this, I think we see that obedience really is necessary for cultivating joy. But not just any kind of obedience, but a very thoughtful obedience. That we use the capacity to think and to reason that God gave us to come to right decisions about what is good, about what is honorable, about what is just. And in acting in obedience, God is working through us to bring about good in our lives and in the lives of those around us. And in this, I think we can cultivate tremendous joy, knowing that even my suffering and obedience in suffering is bringing about something wonderful. At this time, we offer an invitation. And I invite you first and foremost to consider obedience not as a yoke or a burden, but as a way for us to participate in what God is doing. I invite you to consider obedience and thoughtful obedience as a part of how we cultivate joy in our lives. We also offer an invitation for those who have any kind of needs. If you need prayers, if you need help, if you have questions, please don't keep it to yourself. And of course, we offer the opportunity for anyone who has something coming in the way of them and God to take care of that now, so that you can continue immediately throughout the rest of your life in joy, without anything coming between you and God. If there's anything we can do to help you, please talk to us or even make your need known now as we'll stand and sing the invitation.